Picture a funeral in ancient Greece. Not the moment of death, not the coins being placed over the eyes, or the body being prepared, or the family gathering in a house that suddenly feels too large. Those moments got recorded. Those moments got remembered. The moment nobody wrote about is the one just before the first prayer. The family is standing together. The oil lamps are burning low. Someone needs to speak the name of the God who will receive this person they loved. And for just a second, sometimes longer, nobody does. They look at the floor. They look at each other. They say the one below. They say the rich one. They say anything except the actual name. The name is Hades. And here is what most people think they know about him. He is the villain, the dark one, the god of death who rules over suffering and torment and the screaming souls of the damned. He is cold, cruel, and corrupt. He is the reason the underworld looks like hell, because for most of Western culture, it basically became hell. Here is what the actual Greeks believed. Hades was not the god of evil. He was not the god of punishment. He was not even, precisely, the god of death. Death had its own deity, a quiet figure named Thanatos, who went about his work without drama. Hades was something older and stranger and more honest than any of that. He was the god of everything the living world tried not to see. The dead, the buried, the forgotten, the seed beneath the winter soil, the gold beneath the mountain, the grief that lives under every ordinary day like water under rock. All of it belonged to him. All of it was his kingdom, and he ruled it not with cruelty but with something the other gods almost never managed: consistency. What follows is the full story of Hades, where he came from, what he built, who came to challenge him, and what happened when they did. The story of the woman who changed his kingdom and the mother whose grief changed the world. And finally, what it means that we are still telling this story, still avoiding his name, still building entire civilizations around the project of not thinking too carefully about the thing he represents. The Greeks did not fear Hades because he was evil. They feared him because he was right. But before Hades became the name whispered at funerals, before the rivers and the judges and the gates of bronze, he was not a king. He was a child swallowed by a father who feared the future. In the beginning, there was a god who was afraid of his own children. His name was Kronos. He was a titan, one of the great primordial powers who ruled the world before the Olympians existed, before Olympus itself had a name. He had come to power by overthrowing his own father. He knew, the way people who seize power always know, that someone would eventually try to do the same to him. A prophecy confirmed it. His own children would rise against him. One of them would take everything he had built. So Kronos did something that was, by any measure, completely insane, and also, given what he knew about power, completely understandable. When his wife Rhea gave birth to their children, he swallowed them, on by on, as they arrived into the world. He took them back. First came Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 children, 5 gods, swallowed whole, alive, conscious, existing in the darkness, inside their father's body, with nothing to do, and nowhere to go, and no way of knowing if the darkness was ever going to end. The myths do not tell us what it was like inside. That silence is, in its own way, informative. The Greeks were not shy about describing suffering. They described the torments of Tartarus in careful detail. They described the grief of Demeter and the despair of Orpheus with a precision that still feels immediate 3,000 years later. If they chose not to describe what those 5 children experienced, it was probably because the experience resisted description. Some things are too strange to narrate directly. What the myths do tell us is what came out the other side. The myths do not give us the private psychology of those years in the dark. They give us the kingdoms that followed. And in mythology, a kingdom is sometimes the closest thing we get to a confession. Zeus became the god of the open sky. He needed to be seen. He needed to be present, visible, known. His power expressed itself through lightning, through announcement, through the kind of authority that requires an audience. He intervened in human affairs constantly. He showed up. He made himself known. Poseidon became the god of the sea, the restless one, the one that cannot stay still, that moves in every direction at once, that crashes against shores and pulls back and crashes again without ever committing to a single position. His power was kinetic. It needed to go somewhere, and Hades became the god of what is still, of what is permanent, of what goes down and does not come back up, of the darkness that is not a passage through to something brighter, but a destination. Whether the Greeks intended this pattern consciously is something no scholar can say for certain. The myths grew over centuries, shaped by hundreds of voices across dozens of cities and generations, but the pattern is there, and it is hard to look away from once you see it. 3 brothers, 3 kingdoms, 3 very different answers to the same impossible beginning. The darkness inside Kronos did not destroy Hades. It would be too simple to say it prepared him, as if suffering were a training program with guaranteed outcomes. But something happened to him in that place that did not happen to Zeus, who never experienced it, or to Poseidon, who came out needing movement more than anything else. Hades came out knowing how to be still, knowing how to exist in a place where nothing could be seen and nothing was certain, and the only available option was to stay present inside it, to not require it to be anything other than what it was. Most people, given the choice, will choose the lightning bolt, the visible triumph, the announced victory, the kind of power that other people can see and recognize, the kind of power that lets you know it is working. The other kind, the kind that operates in the dark, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that requires you to be comfortable with no one watching and no one recording it, is much harder, and almost no one chooses it. Hades did not choose it. It chose him. But that is often how the most important things work. He came out of his father's body and into a world of light and war and the beginning of a new divine order. And somewhere inside him was the knowledge, learned before he had words for it. That darkness was not the opposite of life. It was where life went when it was finished, and someone would have to be there to receive it. He did not learn to fear the dark. He learned that the dark was where things waited to become real. The war lasted 10 years. That number appears in multiple sources, and it gives you a sense of scale that is easy to underestimate. 10 years of sustained conflict between the Titans, who had ruled the world since before human memory, and the Olympians, who were younger and angrier and had a prophecy on their side. The myths say the earth shook, the seas boiled, the stars were disturbed in their courses. Whatever the Greeks meant by those descriptions, they were reaching for language adequate to something that felt cosmically consequential. Zeus fought with lightning. That detail is so central to his identity that it almost obscures how remarkable it is. The Cyclopes, ancient craftsmen freed during the early stages of the war, gave gifts to the 3 brothers in gratitude. To Zeus they gave the thunderbolt. To Poseidon they gave the trident, the weapon that could shake the earth and churn the sea. To Hades they gave something different. They gave him a helmet. It was called the Helm of Darkness, and it did exactly what the name suggests. Anyone who wore it became impossible to see. The wearer was simply not there, as far as anyone else could tell. Think about that choice for a moment. Zeus received a weapon that announced itself. Everyone knew the lightning was coming from Zeus. The power and the source were inseparable. Poseidon received a weapon that transformed the landscape, that left visible and lasting marks. Hades received a weapon whose entire function was to make the user disappear. The mythology does not record in detail what Hades did during the Titanomachy. That silence is, again, the most revealing thing. Zeus's actions are described. Poseidon's contributions are noted. But what Hades did, while wearing that helmet, moving through the chaos of a 10-year war, exists mostly as inference. It is impossible to say what he did in each specific battle. But the gift he received tells us what kind of role the myth imagined for him. Not the visible strike, the unseen condition that made victory possible. When the Titans finally fell, when the old order collapsed and the new one was ready to be arranged, the three brothers stood together to divide what they had won. Zeus's victory was announced to the sky. Poseidon's power was felt across every ocean. And Hades. He took off the helmet. He stood there, in a world of light that was suddenly organizing itself around categories he had no obvious place in. And he waited to find out what came next. What came next was a jar, and 3 pieces, and the rest of forever. Zeus won the sky because everyone saw the lightning. Hades helped win the war with a weapon designed to leave no witness. Nobody talks about what the 3 brothers said to each other in the moments before they reached into the jar. The sources give us the outcome with the clean efficiency of a legal document recording a property settlement. Zeus drew the sky. Poseidon drew the sea. Hades drew the underworld. Done. Next chapter. What they do not give us is the conversation that preceded it. Because there had to be a conversation. These were not strangers settling an estate. These were 3 beings who had spent years inside their father's body together, who had fought side by side through a decade of war, who had watched the world reshape itself around their collective effort. They knew each other in the way that only shared extremity allows you to know someone. They understood, each of them, what was being divided. The sky meant visibility. It meant being above everything, looking down, intervening, being present in the lives of every creature that lived beneath it. It meant weather, which meant agriculture, which meant human survival, which meant that every farmer who planted a field was in some sense dependent on your goodwill. It meant storms and sunshine and the kind of authority that expressed itself through phenomena that everyone could observe and nobody could ignore. The sea meant freedom. It meant movement, the ability to go anywhere the water went, which was everywhere eventually. It meant the trade routes that connected civilizations, the fish that fed coastline populations, the storms that could sink fleets and the calm that allowed them to sail. The underworld meant everything that ended, every person who died, every creature that stopped living, every moment that became past instead of present, all of it, the entire accumulated weight of everything that had ever existed and stopped, would flow toward whoever held that third portion. It would never stop flowing. It would not diminish over time. It would simply continue, growing larger and more permanent with every generation that lived and died above it. For as long as the world lasted, the sources do not tell us who drew first, or whether the drawing was genuinely random, or whether something more complicated was at work. What they told us, in the consistent and unremarked way that myths convey the things they consider most important, is that Hades accepted what he drew. There is no record of him objecting, no account of a negotiation. A protest, a request to draw again. The sources that give us Zeus's affairs, Poseidon's rages, the detailed emotional weather of every other Olympian, are silent on this point. Hades took the underworld and went there. It is tempting to read that silence as resignation, as the acceptance of someone who knew he had no real choice. But there is another reading that the rest of his story supports more completely. Zeus had to govern rebellion. From the moment he took the sky, he was managing challenges to his authority. Wars among the gods, human heroes who pushed against limits, titans trying to reclaim what they had lost. The sky was not a stable inheritance. It was a position that required constant maintenance, constant intervention, constant assertion. Poseidon had to govern motion. The sea does not sit still. Every time he turned his attention elsewhere, it was doing something new, creating new problems, requiring new responses. Hades governed arrival. His kingdom did not need borders that expanded, because every border eventually opened into it. He did not need to chase his subjects, because his subjects came to him. He did not need to maintain his authority through demonstrations of power, because his authority was built into the structure of existence itself. Everything that lived would eventually stop living. Everything that stopped living would come to him. That was not a policy he had to enforce. It was a fact he had to manage. Whether he understood this when he reached into the jar, whether he saw the full shape of what he was accepting in that moment, is something the myths decline to tell us. But the stillness of his acceptance, the absence of complaint or negotiation in every source that touches on this moment, suggests something beyond resignation. It suggests someone who had already learned, in a decade of war, fought behind a helmet that made him invisible, that the most important work was rarely the work that came with the most recognition, that the thing everyone fought over was not always the thing most worth having, that the permanence of a position mattered more than its glamour. He reached into the jar and pulled out the darkest piece. Then he walked down. No one recorded what his face looked like in that moment. Maybe that was the point. Receiving the underworld was only the beginning. A dark kingdom is not a kingdom until it has borders, laws, servants, and a reason to exist. Hades built all of those things. What he built is worth examining carefully, because it looks nothing like what we were told to expect. Imagine the first soul that ever arrived. No rivers yet, no court, no geography to assign it to, no ferryman to carry it across, no three-headed dog to ensure it stayed. Just a shade, the dim outline of a person, standing in an emptiness that had no name yet, with no understanding of where it was or what was supposed to happen next. Someone had to receive it. Hades did not invent death. He did not create the need for endings. But in myth, he gave endings a place. And before he could give them a place, there was no place. There was only the vague, uncomfortable, undefined space that the Greek imagination had always struggled with when it tried to account for where the dead went. Shades wandered. Spirits drifted. The line between the living world and whatever came after it was porous and unreliable and frightening, in the way that undefined things are always more frightening than defined ones. The darkness was not a destination. It was just darkness. Hades changed that, and what he built in the space below the living world was something the Greeks, over centuries of storytelling, described with a specificity that reveals how seriously they took it. This was not a vague afterlife gesture, a general sense of somewhere the dead ended up. This was a place with geography, with rivers that had names and properties and purposes, with regions that served different functions, with a court that conducted business according to rules that did not change based on who was asking. The underworld had structure, and structure, for the Greeks, was not a small thing. The regions of Hades' kingdom were not divided by the simple binary that most later traditions would impose on the idea of an afterlife. There was no clean good place and bad place. No heaven and hell sorted by the moral quality of a life. The actual geography was considerably more nuanced and, in its own way, more honest. Tartarus was the deepest part. older than the underworld itself in some accounts. The containment at the bottom of everything. It held the Titans who had been chained after their defeat, and those who had committed offenses against the divine order specifically, not ordinary human wrongdoing, but the kind of transgression that violated the fundamental structure of how things were supposed to work. Tartarus was not hell in the sense of a place where bad people went. It was something more precise than that. A containment for a particular category of catastrophic excess. Elysium sat at the other end. It was described as beautiful, as a place of ease and pleasure, as something approximating what the word paradise would eventually come to mean. But the path to Elysium was not straightforward virtue. The Greeks imagined it as a destination for heroes, for those specifically chosen for particular honor, and in later sources for those who had lived with exceptional righteousness and chosen to be reborn multiple times, each time with increasing virtue, until they had earned a permanent place among the blessed. Elysium was real. It was also, by the implicit logic of the myths that describe it, for a very small number of people, and between those two extremes lay the asphodel meadows. This is where most people went, the ordinary dead, those who had lived without particularly distinguishing themselves in either direction, wandered there in a state of diminished consciousness, their identities and memories fading over time, becoming increasingly pale reflections of what they had been. This is a vision of the afterlife that offers almost no consolation. There is no promise that goodness will be rewarded with paradise for anyone but an exceptional few. There is no guarantee that a life lived carefully and decently will result in anything better than a slow dissolution into a grey landscape of forgetfulness. What is remarkable about this vision is not its darkness, but its refusal to lie. In the broad mythic logic this story is tracing, the underworld did not offer cheap comfort. It organized the experience of death into something coherent and lawful, without pretending the organization was more generous than it actually was. Every soul that arrived was received. Every soul was processed according to the same rules. The rules did not bend based on who you had been above ground. Olympus often moved through desire, quarrel, divine favoritism, and sudden intervention. The underworld felt different. It moved slowly, almost impersonally, as if its power came specifically from not needing to change. Hades was not cruel in the way villains are cruel, but he was not gentle in the way the living want gods to be gentle. He was consistent, and consistency can feel merciless when what you want is an exception. The gods of the living world change their minds constantly. The laws of the underworld, as the myth imagined them, were far less negotiable, whether that is the definition of tyranny or the definition of justice. The Greeks spent a long time deciding. Picture a soul moving through the dark. It has just crossed whatever boundary separates the living from the dead, and now it is walking through a landscape it has no reference for. The light is wrong, the air is wrong, and ahead of it, one after another, are rivers, not the rivers it knew above ground, with fish and current and the sound of water moving over rock. These rivers are different. Each one takes something. The Greeks gave these rivers names, and the names were not incidental. They were a theory of what death actually costs, broken down into 5 separate losses, 5 dimensions of what it means to stop being what you were. The first river was the Styx. The Styx was the oldest and most powerful, and its power came not from its size but from what it meant. The gods swore their most binding oaths by the Styx. When a god swore on it and broke that oath, the punishment was severe enough that even immortals took the warning seriously. This was the river of the weight of promises, the place where the boundary between the worlds was most clearly felt, where the fact of crossing became undeniable. To cross the Styx was to accept that you had left, not temporarily. The crossing was the acknowledgement that what had been was finished, and what came next was something different, and the difference was permanent. The second river was Lethe, and Lethe was arguably the most important of them all. Lethe was the river of forgetting. Souls who drank from it lost their memories, not gradually, not selectively, but completely. Every relationship they had built, everything they had learned and felt and decided and regretted, dissolved into the water and was gone. The soul that emerged from Lethe was no longer the person it had been. It was something older and emptier, a consciousness stripped of its particular content, ready to be assigned to whatever the underworld required of it. The Greeks believed that souls going to be reborn drank from Lethe before returning to the world above, so they would not carry the weight of previous lives into the new one. There is something almost merciful in that idea, and something devastating. The price of beginning again was the complete erasure of what you had been before. After Lethe came Charon, the river of woe, the first boundary that the newly dead encountered on the way in, the emotional experience of the threshold itself. Then Phlegethon, the river of fire, which moved downward into the deepest parts of the underworld rather than toward any sea. And finally Cocytus, the river of lamentation, whose waters were filled with the sounds of grief that the dead could not stop making, sounds that could not be heard by anyone above. 5 rivers, 5 different dimensions of what it meant to stop living. What is striking, when you look at them together, is that none of them exist to cause suffering as punishment. They are simply the features of a landscape organized to process, in an orderly way, the experience of ceasing to be what you were, and standing at the center of that landscape, receiving everything that arrived, was Hades. If Lethe was the river of forgetting, then Hades stood as the image of its opposite in the mythic logic of the underworld. The dead dissolved into silence over time. The living eventually stopped speaking the names of those they had lost. Memory above ground was fragile and subject to all the pressures that time puts on everything it touches. But the kingdom kept receiving. Every soul that arrived was registered into the structure of the place, processed through its geography, assigned to its region. In that sense, Hades was not merely the lord of the forgotten, he was the witness to forgetting itself, the one presence in the entire underworld that did not diminish, did not fade, did not eventually stop knowing what it knew. That soul moving through the dark, crossing 5 rivers, losing certainty first, then memory, then the sound of the world above. It would arrive at the other side with almost nothing left of what it had been, and Hades would be there, having seen all of them, remembering what they could no longer remember about themselves. In a place built on dissolution, someone had to hold the shape of things. Every soul that entered his kingdom could eventually forget. The kingdom itself never could. In that sense, Hades was not merely the lord of the dead. He was the only witness to what forgetting actually costs. Before any soul reached the rivers or the judges or the grey fields of asphodel, it had to cross the water, and crossing the water required a boat. On the bank of the Charon, at the first boundary between the newly dead and the deeper geography of the kingdom, a soul would arrive and find itself waiting. Around it would be others, also waiting. Some of them had been there for a very long time, 100 years, in some accounts, before they would be allowed to cross without the thing they were missing, a coin. The soul needed a coin to pay the ferryman, if it had one, placed over the eyes or on the tongue before burial. It would be carried across relatively quickly. If it did not, it would wait on that near bank among the other coinless shades, neither fully in the underworld nor able to return to the world above, occupying a border that was not designed to be permanent, but that, for these particular souls, had become exactly that. Think about what that means for the people left behind. The terror of this was not only that the dead might suffer, it was that the living could fail them. The Greek practice of placing a coin with the body was not superstition. It was moral obligation. It was the living taking responsibility for ensuring that the person they were burying could navigate the first and most basic requirement of the world they were entering. To bury someone without the coin was to abandon them at the very first threshold. And that knowledge turned every funeral into a question: are we doing everything we should? Have we given them what they need to get where they are going? Charon, the ferryman, is one of the most immediately recognizable figures in all of Greek mythology. He appears in the background of dozens of stories, mentioned in passing, present at the margins of every account of a descent to the underworld, and yet almost never described with the kind of detail the Greeks lavished on heroes or gods or monsters. What we know is this: he was old. Almost every source describes him in terms that suggest extreme age. Not the dignified age of wisdom, but the worn, weathered age of something that has been doing the same thing for so long that the doing of it has become indistinguishable from the thing itself. He had a boat. He had an oar. He stood at the near bank and waited. And the dead came to him, and he took them across. He was not a monster. He was a man doing a job that had never ended and would never end. There is something in that image, the ancient ferryman standing at the water in the permanent dark, that the Greeks found compelling enough to preserve across centuries of storytelling. Not because he was frightening, but because he was relentless. He kept showing up. He kept taking people across. He never stopped. On the far bank of the river, at the entrance to the kingdom proper, was Cerberus. 3 heads, in most sources, each one looking in a different direction, so that no single point of distraction could leave the gate unguarded. He was described as enormous, as built on a scale that suggested he was not simply a large dog, but something that had been made for a specific architectural purpose, like a door that had been given teeth. And here is the thing that almost every retelling of his story gets wrong. Cerberus did not stop the dead from entering. He stopped them from leaving. That inversion is the entire point. The gate he guarded opened inward, not outward. The dead came through, and he let them. The living who came to the underworld. The heroes and the wanderers and the desperate. Those were the anomalies, the exceptions. And his response to them varied in ways the myths find interesting, precisely because they reveal something about the nature of the rule. What Cerberus existed to prevent was the ordinary dead slipping back out, the shades who had crossed, who had been received into the kingdom, who were in the process of becoming whatever the dead become, simply walking back through the door they had come in. A universe in which the dead could freely return whenever they chose would not be a universe in which anything meant anything. The weight of choices, the significance of moments, the reality of loss, all of it depended on death being real, on the door closing, on something standing at the exit to make it so. The heroes who got past him did so by means specific to their particular situation. Orpheus played music. Psyche offered honey cakes. Heracles, as we will see, used methods entirely his own. But each exception reinforced the rule, the fact that getting past Cerberus required something extraordinary, something specific and costly, and in each case, unrepeatable. Was the myth's way of saying that the door was real, that it was closed for a reason, that what it protected was worth protecting. Cerberus was not a monster placed at the gate to terrify the arriving dead. He was the reason the gate meant something, and every door, to mean anything at all, has to close. There is a name for Hades that most people have never heard. The Greeks used it regularly, more regularly in some periods than the name Hades itself. The name was Plauton. It passed into Latin as Pluto, which is how the Romans knew him. and from there into the astronomical naming conventions that eventually gave Pluto to the small, cold, distant body at the edge of the solar system. That choice made more sense than most people realize. Platon means the rich one, the wealthy one, the one who has abundance. Sit with that for a moment. This is not the name you would invent for a god of death if death was simply the end of things, the subtraction of life, the void that remains when existence stops. You do not call a void wealthy. You do not describe an absence as abundant. The name Platon points towards something that the modern understanding of Hades almost entirely misses, a dimension of his identity that the Greeks considered important enough to name him for, and that changes the entire shape of what he represented. Hades was not only the god of the dead, he was the god of everything buried, and buried things are not always dead things. Consider what lies beneath the surface of the earth, not in the abstract, but literally, physically, in the world the Greeks actually inhabited. Beneath the soil of a ploughed field lay the seeds that would become next year's harvest, the grain that would feed the city through the winter, the potential that existed in its most compressed and hidden form before it had expressed itself as anything visible. The seed was not dead. It was waiting. It was doing its most essential work in the dark, in the place that belonged to Hades, in the soil that was, by the logic of the Greek imagination, his domain. Beneath the mountains lay the metal that became the weapons and the tools and the coins and the ornaments that organized human civilization, the gold that paid armies, the bronze that made shields, the iron that tipped arrows. All of it came from underground. All of it had to be extracted from the darkness that was Hades's kingdom before it could do anything in the world of light. The wealth of the ancient world was literally subterranean. It came from below. Beneath the winter lay the spring. This was the one that mattered most to the Greeks, the one they built their deepest rituals around, the one that would eventually become the central story of Hades's personal life in ways we will examine in detail. The earth in winter is not dead. It is holding. The warmth is somewhere under the surface. The green is dormant rather than gone. The capacity for renewal is present and real, even when nothing visible confirms it. The Greeks understood this not as meteorology, but as mythology. The spring returned because something beneath the earth permitted it. The growing season was a gift from the place of the dead. Many things the living world depends on begin in concealment. That is the principle the name Platon encodes. The richness of Hades was not the richness of accumulation, of stored treasure, of hoarded wealth sitting in vaults. It was the richness of potential, of what had not yet expressed itself, of what was still becoming. He was not the god standing at the end of things, waiting to receive whatever fell into his hands. He was the ground beneath things, the condition that made the next thing possible, the darkness that the seed passed through on its way to becoming wheat, the depth that the root descended into before it could support anything above. This is why the Greeks gave him the name of wealth rather than the name of death, at least in the contexts where they were being careful, because death, as they understood it through his mythology, was not the opposite of richness. It was where richness came from. The soil was rich because the dead were in it. The fields were fertile because of what lay beneath them. The world of the living was sustained, generation after generation, by the kingdom of the one they were afraid to name. Hades was terrifying because he stood beneath life, not outside it. And if everything buried belonged to him, then one day, the thing buried beneath the earth would not be gold, or seed, or bone. It would be a girl picking flowers in a field, and the shape of the year itself would change because of it. He was not the opposite of life. He was what life grew from. A king arrives in the underworld. Not just any king, a powerful one. A man who in his life commanded armies, filled treasuries, decided the fates of thousands with a word spoken from a high seat. He is accustomed to rooms that rearrange themselves around his presence. He is accustomed to the particular quality of attention that powerful people receive, the slight forward lean of advisors, the careful way that everyone in the room waits for him to speak before forming an opinion. He arrives at the court of the underworld, and something is immediately wrong. There is no bodyguard behind him. There is no herald to announce his name and his titles and the list of his accomplishments. There is no advocate to present his case in the most favorable possible light. No priest whose prayers might tip a divine judgment in his direction. His wealth, which above ground had opened every door he had ever wanted opened, is not here. His beauty, if he had it, is not here. His name, which in certain cities could make a room go quiet with a particular kind of respect, lands here with exactly the weight it deserves, which is the weight of what he actually did, and nothing more. He stands before 3 judges, and for the first time in his life, he cannot work the room. Minos had been king of Crete, one of the most powerful rulers in the pre-Olympian Greek world, known during his life for a legal code that later Greeks regarded as foundational, a system of laws that had organized a civilization. He brought that capacity for systematic thinking about justice into his role, handling the souls of those who had come from certain territories. Rhadamanthus was known during his life for the quality of his judgment, and was regarded in most sources as the most rigorous of the 3, the one least susceptible to any form of appeal or persuasion. He was not cruel. He was precise. There is a difference, though it does not always feel like one when you are on the receiving end of it. Aeacus had been known specifically for his piety and his fairness, for the quality of his relationship with the divine order rather than merely the human one. 3 former kings, 3 men who had spent their lives inside systems of power and had learned, from that experience, exactly how those systems failed. And here is what made the court of the underworld different from every other court that king had ever stood in. Above ground, the scales of justice were constantly being adjusted by forces that had nothing to do with justice. Beauty moved judges. Wealth moved them. Family connection, the right advocate, the right offering to the right priest. All of it created a meaningful difference in outcomes. This was not a secret. The Greeks knew it. They wrote about it, complained about it, built entire tragedies around the gap between what justice was supposed to be and what it actually was in practice. In the court of the underworld, as the myth imagined it, none of that applied. The soul stood before the judges, stripped of everything it had used to navigate the world above. No body, which meant no beauty, no physical presence, no wealth, which had stayed behind with the body, no name that carried social weight, because social weight only existed in a social world, and that world was no longer relevant. No advocates, no political connections, no divine patron whose favor might tip the balance. The soul stood alone with what it had actually done. This is what the underworld imagined, that the world above almost never offered. A place where the soul could not hide behind the things it had accumulated, could not use the privileges of its particular life to buffer itself from the consequences of its choices. Hades did not sit in personal judgment over every soul that arrived. He had designed a system and staffed it with people capable of running it without his constant involvement. The intelligence that built the rivers and the geography and the law of the coin extended to the question of judgment itself. He understood that justice was not best served by the personal intervention of power, even well-intentioned power. It was best served by a process, staffed by the right people, operating according to rules that did not change based on who was watching. That is a colder and more durable kind of intelligence than personal power. It is the intelligence of a ruler who does not need to appear in every verdict to make his presence felt. That king, standing before Minos and Rhadamanthus and Aeacus, is about to find out what his life actually added up to. Not what it looked like from the high seat, not how it was described by the historians he paid to record it. What it was. The court beneath the earth did not promise comfort. It promised exposure. Hades did not create injustice. He imagined a place where injustice had far fewer places to hide, and that, somehow, made him the most frightening god of all. But every system reveals itself most clearly when someone tries to break it. And in Greek myth, the living never stopped trying to cheat the god who waited below. Before we talk about what Sisyphus did, we should talk about who he was, because the myth has a tendency to jump straight to the boulder, to the hill, to the image of a man pushing an enormous weight up a slope that always defeats him at the last moment, and in doing so it skips the part that makes the punishment make sense. Sisyphus was a king of Corinth who had spent his entire life treating the rules that governed other people as suggestions that did not apply to him. He betrayed the secrets of the gods when it suited him. He cheated guests, which in the Greek world was one of the most serious violations available to a human being, since hospitality was considered sacred and its violation an offense against Zeus himself. He accumulated power and wealth through methods that the sources describe with consistent distaste. The distaste of people who recognized in his behavior a kind of intelligence turned entirely toward the project of getting away with things. He was, in other words, very good at finding gaps. The problem was that the system he eventually decided to navigate was the one that Hades ran. The first time Sisyphus cheated death, he did it with genuine planning. He managed to chain Thanatos, the god of death, himself, preventing him from carrying out the function that kept mortality real. With Thanatos bound, no one in the world could die. Soldiers fell in battle and got back up. Old people who should have faded away lingered on in increasing discomfort. The natural processes that depended on death to make room for new life stalled in ways that were, for the living world, increasingly catastrophic. In one common version, Ars intervenis, because a world where no one dies in battle is intolerable to the god of war. When Thanatos was released, the first order of business was collecting Sisyphus, who was taken down to the underworld to face whatever accounting awaited him. This is where it gets interesting. Before he died, Sisyphus had given his wife very specific instructions. She was not to perform the proper burial rites. She was not to place the coin. She was not to do any of the things that constituted the formal acknowledgement that a person had died and needed to be received by the world below. Sisyphus arrived in the underworld improperly prepared. No rites, no coin, and he went to Persephone, the queen of the underworld, with a complaint and a request. The complaint was that his wife had failed in her duty. The request was that he be allowed to return to the world above long enough to punish her for this failure, to arrange his own proper funeral rites, to set the situation right. After that, he promised he would return voluntarily. Persephone granted the request. Sisyphus went back to Corinth, sat down in the sunlight, ate a meal, and did not return. He lived out a long life above ground. Having successfully talked his way out of the underworld through a combination of a legitimate procedural complaint and a promise he had absolutely no intention of keeping, now sit with what that means from the perspective of Hades's kingdom. The system had been beaten, not by overwhelming force, not by divine intervention, not by a hero with supernatural gifts, but by a mortal king who had looked at the mechanics of the process and found a gap that the process had not accounted for, the requirement of proper burial rites, which existed for good reasons, had been deliberately exploited as a loophole. The appeal to the queen had been made in bad faith. The promise had been empty. When Sisyphus finally died for the second time, aged and having exhausted the extension his cleverness had purchased, He returned to the underworld to find that the accounting had been running in his absence. His punishment is the most famous in all of Greek mythology. He was condemned to push an enormous boulder up a hill, and every time he reached the top, the boulder would roll back down, and he would have to begin again, for eternity. The task never completed, the progress never permanent, the effort endless and the outcome always the same. Much later, philosophers would see Sisyphus as a symbol of absurd human endurance, of the confrontation between human effort and a universe indifferent to it. But long before philosophy named the absurd, the myth had already imagined a man trapped inside the shape of his own evasion. Because the punishment is not arbitrary. It is precise, in a way that reveals exactly what kind of intelligence designed it. Sisyphus had spent his life finding ways to avoid the consequences of his actions. He had built his entire identity around the project of never being held to account, of always having another angle, another argument, another door he could talk his way through. His genius was specifically the genius of perpetual deferral. He could always make the moment of reckoning be the next moment's problem. The boulder is the eternal recurrence of the moment just before completion. The moment where he is almost there, almost done, almost free of the hill, and then is not. The punishment does not torture him with pain. It tortures him with his own methodology. It gives him, forever, a task that looks like it might be finished, that always seems to be approaching its conclusion, and then is not. The man who spent his life avoiding permanent consequences has been given a permanent consequence that takes the form of avoiding nothing. Hades did not rage at being tricked. There is no account of him crying out, no dramatic confrontation, no expression of wounded pride. He looked at the gap in the system, understood how it had been exploited, and designed a response that was, in its own way, more intelligent than the exploit itself. Sisyphus won every battle against death. He lost the only war that mattered, the one against the weight of a life spent only in avoiding it. The story of Orpheus begins with a fact that the myths state simply and that no simple statement can quite contain. He was the greatest musician who had ever lived. The Greeks meant this literally. His music did things that music, by the ordinary rules of how music works, should not have been able to do. Trees uprooted themselves and walked toward the sound of his lyre. Rivers changed course to flow closer to where he played. Wild animals approached without aggression and sat in a circle around him and listened. The line between what the music expressed and what the physical world did in response to it was, in his case, thinner than it was for anyone else who had ever picked up an instrument. He married Eurydice. The sources do not spend much time on the courtship or the wedding, which is the mythology telling you that the happiness was not the point. It was the brief, bright interval that made what came after comprehensible. Eurydice died shortly after they were married. A snake bite. In most versions, she was in a meadow, and then she was gone, and Orpheus was left with his music and the absence of the person who had made the music feel like it was for something. What he did next was, by any reasonable standard, impossible. He decided to go get her back. Not in the metaphorical sense, not in the sense of keeping her memory alive through his art. He decided to go to the underworld, while still alive, and ask for her return. The journey down is described in different sources with different emphases, but the constants are the rivers, the crossing, the approach toward the throne of Hades, and Orpheus, arriving at the court of the god who did not make exceptions, did the only thing he had. He played. What the music sounded like is not something any ancient text can actually convey, because the experience of hearing Orpheus play was specifically the experience of hearing something for which language had not been designed. The myths gesture at its effect rather than describing its content. The shades in the underworld stopped their eternal wandering. In some accounts, Even the powers of punishment were imagined as pausing. The stone of Sisyphus held still for a moment at the top of its hill, and in several versions of the story, the rulers of the underworld were moved by it. That detail is worth staying with, because it is one of the most unexpected things in the entire mythology of Hades. This was a god who had been receiving the dead since the beginning of the world. Every soul that had ever arrived had arrived with its own grief, its own losses, its own catalogue of what had been left behind. He had been present for more human suffering than any being in the Greek cosmos, accumulating it without apparent response for longer than human memory could measure. And then a musician sat in his throne room and played, and something in the king of the dead responded to it. He agreed to let Eurydice go, with one condition. Orpheus was to lead Eurydice back through the underworld and up to the living world above. She would follow behind him. He was not to look back at her until both of them had fully crossed the threshold into the world of light. If he looked back before that moment, she would be returned to the underworld immediately and permanently. The condition has been read in many ways across the centuries. Some see it as a cruel game, designed by a god who knew human nature well enough to know that Orpheus would fail. Other readings see it as a genuine offer made in good faith. The reading that fits best with the portrait of Hades that the rest of the mythology builds is neither of those. The condition asked for exactly one thing: faith in the dark, the willingness to move toward what you love without being able to see it, to trust that it is there because you have been told it is there, to keep walking without turning around to verify that the thing you cannot lose is still present behind you. That capacity, the ability to trust in the dark, to keep moving without constant confirmation, was what the underworld ran on. The shades who dissolved into asphodel did so without being able to confirm where they were going. The entire experience of the underworld was an experience of proceeding without the visual evidence that the living world relied on as proof. Hades was offering Orpheus a chance to bring something back from below, but only if he could demonstrate the capacity that the underworld required of everyone who passed through it. Orpheus walked up through the dark. Eurydice followed. The ascent was long. The silence was complete, except for the sound of his footsteps and, presumably, hers, which he could not quite hear clearly enough to be certain of. And that uncertainty is what undid him. He was not weak. He was not faithless in the ordinary sense. He was a man whose entire relationship with reality ran through his senses, whose gift was the ability to translate what he perceived into something that moved the world. He needed to hear. He needed to see. He needed the confirmation that the physical world provided, because without it he had no way to know if what he believed was true. He turned around. Eurydice's face, briefly visible in the dark, and then gone. Hades did not pursue Orpheus back to the living world. He did not send consequences or punishment. He had made an offer. He had attached a condition. Orpheus had not met the condition. The terms of the agreement resolved themselves without anyone needing to enforce them. The underworld opened once, not because death was defeated, but because grief was real enough to move the unmovable. And when it closed again, it was not Hades who looked away first. Orpheus returned to the world above alone, and played his music there until he died. And the music was changed by what it had been through, and the people who heard it knew something had happened to him that had not happened to anyone else. He had been to the place below and had almost brought someone back. Almost. There is a specific kind of problem that every well-designed system eventually faces, not the problem of being attacked by something stronger than itself. Systems built for permanence tend to handle direct assault reasonably well. The problem is something subtler: what happens when something arrives that the system was not designed to process. Something that does not fit the categories. Something that belongs to neither the living nor the dead in the way those terms were meant to apply. Heracles was that problem. He came to the underworld as his 12th and final labor. sent by Eurystheus, with instructions that were, even by the standards of a king who had spent years trying to find tasks lethal enough to kill the man he feared. Remarkable in their ambition, he was to descend into the kingdom of the dead while alive, find Cerberus, and bring the guardian of the underworld back to the surface as proof of completion. The instruction assumed a certain outcome. It assumed that the underworld would do what the underworld did to living things that entered it without authorization. It assumed, in other words, that Heracles would not come back. He came back, but the story of how he got in, how he navigated the kingdom, and most importantly, how he got Cerberus, is not primarily a story about Heracles. It is a story about Hades, and about what the kingdom of the dead revealed when the living world's most powerful being walked into it uninvited. What the myth records is that Hades received him, not warmly, not with the hospitality that Zeus might have extended to a son of his, with feasting and gifts and the performance of divine generosity. But Hades did not send Heracles away, did not unleash the forces of the underworld against him, did not treat the intrusion as the violation of sacred boundaries that it technically was. He received him because the kingdom had rules, and the rules applied to everyone who arrived at its gates, including those who arrived alive and uninvited, and carrying weapons. Heracles came with everything he was, the lion skin across his shoulders, the club in his hand, the body that had defeated the Nemean lion with bare hands, that had navigated the labyrinthine logic of the Hydra, that had traveled to the edge of the world and back. He brought to the underworld the same thing he brought to every situation he had ever encountered, the expectation that sufficient force, applied with sufficient will, would resolve the problem in front of him. And Hades set a single condition. If Heracles wanted to take Cerberus, he could. The underworld would not prevent it. But he could not use weapons, no club, no arrows, no tools constructed for the purpose of overwhelming resistance. Whatever he intended to do with Cerberus, he had to do with his body alone. The condition was not designed to humiliate him. It was something more precise than that. In the underworld, the logic that governed the living world did not apply. Above ground, Heracles' strength expressed itself through weapons, through tools, through the amplification of his natural gifts by things he had made or been given. His arrows were poisoned. His club was fashioned for maximum impact. The system of violence that made him effective in the living world was a system that depended on extension, on the multiplication of native capacity through equipment. Below ground, that system had no purchase. This was the place where every weapon ever made had already been surrendered, every sword that had ever killed a man, every arrow that had ever ended a life. All of it had been left behind at the border. The dead arrived without their equipment. They always had. The underworld processed souls, not the things souls had used. To bring weapons into it was to speak a language the place did not recognize. Heracles understood this in the way that people who are genuinely capable, rather than merely powerful, understand things. He set down the club. He left the arrows where they were. He went to find Cerberus with nothing but what had always been. Underneath all the equipment, and the legend, and the accumulated weight of 12 labors, the essential thing, himself. For once, the thing in front of him was not there to be slain. It was there to be respected. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Every other labor had been, at its core, about elimination. The pattern of the labors was the pattern of removing threats, of making the world safer by making dangerous things in it no longer dangerous. Cerberus was not a threat to be eliminated. He was a guardian doing his job, a job that the underworld required him to do, a job that Hades had designed the entire geography of his kingdom around. To kill him would have been to damage the system in a way that no amount of heroic achievement could justify. Heracles subdued Cerberus without killing him. He used his strength in its most direct form, without amplification, without the tools that usually stood between his capability and its object. He carried the three-headed guardian up to the surface and presented him to Eurystheus, who responded to the sight of the creature standing in his throne room with a quality of terror that the sources describe with evident enjoyment. The labor was acknowledged, and then Heracles returned Cerberus to the underworld. He returned him because Hades had asked him to, as the condition of the borrowing, but also because Heracles understood, in the way that the greatest heroes understand things they could not necessarily articulate, that what Cerberus guarded was worth guarding, that the door the three-headed dog stood at was a door that needed to be there. He carried Cerberus back down and handed him to the god who had let him borrow the guardian of death in the first place. Even the strongest man in the world understood that some laws exist for reasons larger than any single hero's need. Hades had known that from the beginning. Tartarus is the part of the underworld that has done the most damage to Hades's reputation. This requires some untangling, because the damage is almost entirely based on a category error, on the confusion between a place and its purpose, between a region of the underworld and the values of the god who governed the whole of it. Tartarus exists. Its punishments are real. Within the logic of the mythology, the suffering of the souls confined there is genuine. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute is what Tartarus actually represents, and whether the design of its punishments reflects the cruelty of an evil god or something considerably more sophisticated. Start with Tantalus. Tantalus was a king who had been given extraordinary gifts by the gods. He was invited to dine with them, an honor extended to almost no mortal in the entire Greek mythological tradition. He sat at the table of the Olympians. He participated in their conversation. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most favored mortal of his generation. What he did with that favor was this: he killed his own son, cooked him, and served him to the gods at a subsequent feast, apparently to test whether their divinity meant they could detect the nature of what they were eating. The gods detected it. They restored his son to life, and Tantalus was sent to Tartarus, where he stands forever in a pool of water beneath a tree heavy with fruit. When he reaches down to drink, the water recedes. When he reaches up to eat, the branches pull away. He is surrounded by sustenance and permanently denied it. The easy reading of this is simple cruelty. A powerful god punishing a mortal who transgressed by inflicting an eternal version of the very suffering he was most afraid of. The more careful reading notices something different. Tantalus committed his crime in the context of a feast, of eating, of the relationship between host and guest. That was, for the Greeks, among the most sacred available. He violated the hospitality of the gods by using their table as the setting for an experiment in their limits. He treated the most sacred meal he would ever attend as an opportunity to test the boundaries of what he could get away with. His punishment is a feast that never feeds him. He is surrounded by the thing he corrupted, forever, unable to access it. The punishment is not the imposition of a new suffering. It is the permanent extension of the dynamic he created. He chose to be in a relationship with divine hospitality, defined by what he could extract from it rather than what it meant. His eternity is that relationship, sustained indefinitely. That is not cruelty. That is precision. Consider Ixion. Ixion had committed a murder and been forgiven for it by Zeus, an act of divine clemency unusual enough that the myth records it specifically. Zeus brought Ixion to Olympus, gave him access to the table of the gods, extended to him the extraordinary gift of divine hospitality. Ixion responded by attempting to assault Hera. He was bound to a wheel of fire that spins forever. He goes around and around, the rotation never stopping, the direction never changing, the motion never resolving into arrival anywhere. The wheel is his own desire. Given permanent mechanical form, he moved toward something he had no right to reach for, with an urgency that overrode every other consideration, every gift he had been given, every obligation he had incurred. The wheel is what that impulse looks like when it cannot be satisfied and cannot be stopped. He keeps moving. He never gets anywhere. The motion that defined his transgression is now the entirety of his existence. The Danaids, the 50 daughters of Danaus who murdered their husbands on their wedding night, pour water into vessels that have no bottom. The water runs out as fast as it goes in. The task can never be completed because the container was not designed to hold what they were given. They destroyed the container of marriage on the night it was supposed to be filled. Their punishment is a container that cannot be filled, an effort that cannot succeed, a task whose completion is structurally impossible because the thing that was supposed to make completion possible was what they destroyed. In mythic logic, the punishments of Tartarus were not designed to hurt. They were designed to be true. This is the distinction that changes everything about how Tartarus should be understood. The punishments are not the imposition of suffering from outside, not the expression of a god's anger, or wounded pride, or desire for revenge. They are the logical extension of what the punished souls had already chosen to be. Each one had built, through the pattern of their choices, a specific relationship with the world. The punishment makes that relationship permanent. The mythic imagination organized around Hades looked at each soul and saw not just what it had done, but what it had been, the shape of its desire, the pattern of its transgression, the specific way it had oriented itself toward the world and toward other people, and then gave it that orientation. Forever. That requires a kind of intelligence that is genuinely frightening, not the intelligence of power, of the ability to overwhelm resistance, the intelligence of understanding, of seeing through the surface of an action to the structure of the self that produced it. The punishments of Tartarus were not arbitrary. They were not the expressions of cruelty in search of a target. In mythic logic, they were the most honest thing. The underworld produced a mirror held up to what the soul had actually chosen to be, and the offer of that choice as a permanent condition. Be careful what you become. In the kingdom below, you get to keep it. Yet the greatest challenge to Hades did not come from a hero, a trickster, or a singer. It came from a girl in a field, a grieving mother, and a marriage the world itself refused to accept quietly. There is a meadow in the oldest version of this story, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, composed sometime in the 7th or 6th century before the Common Era, is the earliest sustained account we have of what happened between Hades and Persephone, and it begins there, in a meadow, with flowers, roses and crocuses and violets and irises and hyacinths, and a narcissus of unusual beauty, planted by the earth at the request of Zeus. The hymn says, as a lure for the girl with the flower-bright face, Persephone was reaching for the narcissus when the earth opened. The hymn describes what followed, without ambiguity and without softening. Hades came up through the gap in the earth in his golden chariot, seized her, and drove back down. She cried out. She called for her father Zeus. She called for her mother. The peaks of the mountains and the depths of the sea carried the sound of her voice, and her mother heard it. And the world began to change in response to what had happened. That is the oldest account we have. It is worth sitting with exactly as it is, without immediately reaching for a more comfortable frame. She did not go willingly. In this version, she was not consulted. She was in a field, and then she was not. And the transition happened to her rather than being chosen by her. and the sound she made in the moment of it was the sound of someone calling for help that did not come in time. Telling this story honestly means not looking away from that, and it also means not stopping there, because the story is more complicated than any single moment in it. And the complication begins with a detail that the Homeric hymn includes, almost in passing, as if it were obvious rather than consequential. Zeus had agreed to the marriage beforehand. Hades did not act without authorization. He went to Zeus, the father of Persephone, the king of the gods, the figure whose consent constituted the only form of approval that the Greek world recognized as binding in matters of this kind. And Zeus said yes. The abduction was not a rogue act by an outlaw god. It was the execution of an arrangement that the most powerful being in the cosmos had already sanctioned. What that tells us about Zeus is one kind of story. What it tells us about Persephone's situation is another. She was not only taken by Hades, she was given by her father. The two men with the most power over her life had reached an agreement about it, and she was not part of the conversation. The Greeks knew this. They built it into the myth. The hymn does not present Zeus's prior consent as exculpatory. It presents it as part of the landscape of the story, part of the arrangement of power within which Demeter's grief and Persephone's removal were both embedded. The world that produced this myth was a world in which fathers arranged daughters' marriages, in which the woman being married was not a formal part of the negotiation, in which what she wanted was understood to be a different kind of question from the question of what would happen. The myth preserved that world without endorsing it and without pretending it was something other than what it was. This is one of the reasons the story has lasted 3,000 years. It did not resolve its own discomfort. It did not tidy itself into a form that made everyone feel better about what had occurred. It held the tension between what happened and what the people involved felt about what happened, without collapsing that tension into a simple verdict. Some later traditions and interpretations gave Persephone a more active role, imagined her as someone who participated in her transition between worlds with some degree of awareness or willingness. The Orphic tradition, which developed its own complex theological framework around the mythology of the underworld, imagined dimensions of her story that the Homeric hymn does not include. Philosophers and poets across centuries pulled the myth in different directions, finding in it different emphases that suited different purposes. The older source is less comfortable and less romantic than many of those later retellings. That discomfort is part of what makes it worth reading carefully, because what the older source captures, in its unresolved way, is something true about the relationship between power and the people who live inside it. Persephone did not have the option of a simple story. She was placed at the intersection of divine power, familial obligation, and the specific violence of a transition she had not chosen, and she had to make something of that situation with whatever she had. What she made of it is the subject of a later chapter. For now, the meadow, the Narcissus, the earth opening, the chariot going down, and the sound of a voice carrying across mountains and sea, reaching the ears of the one person in the world most likely to refuse to accept what had happened. The myth has survived not because it offers resolution, but because it refuses one. That is the kind of story that lasts. Demeter heard her daughter's voice and everything changed. She heard it the way parents hear the sounds their children make in distress, across any distance, through any obstacle, with a specificity of recognition that cuts through everything else competing for attention. The voice was Persephone's. The sound in the voice was wrong, and Demeter left what she was doing, which was the work of the growing world, the maintenance of the fertility that sustained every living thing, and went looking. She searched for 9 days. 9 days without eating, 9 days without drinking, 9 days without resting. She moved through the world with a torch in each hand, because she searched by night as well as day, because the searching did not stop when the light did. She asked everyone she encountered. She asked the mortals in the fields and the gods of the rivers and the beings at the edges of the known world. But most of them had not seen anything. Most of them could not tell her what she needed to know. It was Hecate, goddess of crossroads, who had heard the voice without seeing its source, and Helios, the sun, who had seen everything from his position above the world, who finally told her the truth. Her daughter was in the underworld. She was the wife of Hades. Zeus had arranged it. What followed was not an explosion of divine rage, not the dramatic confrontation that the power of a goddess like Demeter might suggest. It was something quieter and more devastating. She did not go to Olympus to present her case through the channels that the divine hierarchy provided. She understood, in the way that people understand things when they have just been told that the powerful arranged something terrible and called it acceptable, that those channels would not give her what she needed. So she withdrew. She disguised herself as an old woman and walked among mortals. She sat with human grief rather than divine resolution. She accepted the hospitality of a family in Eleusis, a city that would later become one of the most sacred sites in the Greek world, precisely because of what began there. And she stopped doing the thing that the world required of her. The earth stopped producing. The grain did not grow. The furrows that human labor had opened in the soil produced nothing. The seeds went into the ground and stayed there, or rotted, or simply failed to do what seeds are supposed to do. The cattle pulled the plows across fields that would not respond. The farmers did the work, and the work produced nothing. A child. The world began to starve. Demeter did not attack Olympus with weapons. She did not declare war on Zeus or challenge the divine order through any of the mechanisms that the mythology around other gods imagines for the expression of divine anger. She withdrew fertility from the world. It was the quietest rebellion in Greek myth, and perhaps the most devastating. She simply stopped doing the thing that made human survival possible, and the consequences moved outward from that refusal like water from a stone dropped in a pond, reaching every living thing that depended on the relationship between soil and season. Zeus noticed. The gods noticed, because the mortals who had been dying in increasing numbers were no longer performing the rituals, making the sacrifices, sending up the prayers that the gods depended on. A world without living humans was a world without divine worship, and that was a problem that even the king of the gods could not afford to ignore indefinitely. He sent Hermes to the underworld. Hermes, the messenger, the guide of souls, the one god who moved freely between all realms, went down to deliver a message. The message was essentially this: the arrangement needed to be adjusted. Persephone needed to be able to return to her mother, at least some of the time, because the alternative was a world of the dead with no new arrivals, since the living would all be starving, which was not a sustainable situation for anyone involved. Hades agreed to let Persephone go. What happened in the moment before she left the underworld, what passed between them in the last minutes before her departure, is where the myth places its most concentrated ambiguity. And the ambiguity takes the form of fruit, small red seeds, the food of the place she had been living in, consumed by her in a moment that the sources describe with varying degrees of detail and varying degrees of intention on everyone's part. She ate. Some number of seeds went into her mouth, and the thing that would have been a clean departure, a full return, a complete restoration of the situation to its condition before the earth opened in the meadow, became instead something more complicated. The world got Persephone back, but it got her for only part of the year. The grief that Demeter carried was not resolved by the return. It was restructured. Instead of permanent loss, she received periodic loss, the disappearance of her daughter for a portion of every year, the knowledge that the separation would come again, and the earth responded to Demeter's grief as it always had. When Persephone was above, the world grew. When she went below again, the world held still and waited. The gods could control the seasons, the seas, the fates of men, but no god in the Greek universe had ever figured out how to control grief. That was the one force older than all of them. The Greeks looked at winter and did not see emptiness. They saw a mother who was counting the days. In one familiar version of the story, it was 6 seeds. In others, the number is different. Some sources say 4. Some do not specify a number at all, mentioning only the fruit, the eating, the consequence. The Greeks were not always consistent on the precise arithmetic of how Persephone became bound to the underworld, and that inconsistency is itself informative. What mattered to the people telling this story across centuries was not the count. It was the act, the fact of eating, the fact that something went from the underworld into her body and stayed there, connecting her to the place in a way that could not be undone by simply walking back through the gate. The pomegranate was not a random choice. In the Greek world, the pomegranate was already loaded with meaning before it appeared in this story. It was present at weddings, associated with fertility and the abundance of seed, with the capacity for life to multiply itself. It was also present at funerals, offered to the dead as sustenance for the journey, placed alongside the body as provision for a world where the ordinary sources of food no longer applied. It existed at both ends of the human experience, simultaneously, the beginning and the conclusion, which made it exactly the right fruit for a story that was itself about the relationship between those two things. The color of its seeds was the color of blood, which in the Greek imagination was not a morbid association but a vital one. Blood was what the shades in the underworld lacked, the living substance that gave them weight and memory and the ability to speak. When Odysseus traveled to the edges of the underworld in the Odyssey and needed the dead to become coherent enough to answer his questions, he gave them blood to drink. The pomegranate seeds that Persephone consumed were, in the symbolic logic of the myth, the inverse of that transaction. Instead of bringing the living substance of the upper world down to animate the dead, she was taking the substance of the lower world up into herself. The question that has occupied everyone who has ever engaged seriously with this story is the question of whether she knew what she was doing. The sources do not agree. In some versions, Hades gives her the seeds deliberately, understanding that consumption will bind her. In these readings, the eating is presented as a form of contract, the underworld's claim on her made permanent through her own body's participation in the place. In other versions, she eats without understanding the consequence, taking food because she is hungry, or because the fruit was beautiful, or because she had been there long enough that the ordinary human acts of eating and drinking had resumed without the weight of significance she would have attached to them if she had known. In at least one tradition, she is told beforehand. She eats anyway. The Greeks who told and retold this story over centuries did not reach consensus on which version was true, and that failure of consensus is worth taking seriously. It suggests that the question of what she knew and what she chose was genuinely difficult, that it resisted the kind of clean resolution that would have allowed the tradition to settle on a single account. The ambiguity was preserved not because no one thought about it, but because everyone who thought about it arrived at a different answer. What the ambiguity protects is the complexity of what happened. If she ate without knowing, then the binding is something done to her. Another instance of the larger pattern in which the powerful made decisions that shaped her life without her participation. If she ate, knowing, then she was a participant in her own transformation. An agent in the story, even if the agency expressed itself in a small and irreversible act rather than a grand declaration. If she was told and ate anyway, then the question of what she wanted becomes unavoidable. and whatever answer you arrive at changes the entire shape of what the story is about. The pomegranate holds all three of these possibilities at once. That is why it has been returning to the center of this story for 3,000 years. Why it keeps appearing in paintings and poems and songs, and every form that the myth has taken as it moved through time. It is the hinge point, the moment where the story could have gone differently, where a different choice, a different piece of information, a different set of circumstances might have produced a different outcome. And it did not. A handful of seeds below the earth became the rhythm of the year. The Greeks looked at winter and saw not emptiness but consequence, not absence, but the cost of something that had happened in the dark, in a moment that no one fully understood, including perhaps the one who made it. The seeds were eaten. The consequence followed. Persephone would spend part of every year below and part above, bound to both worlds simultaneously, belonging completely to neither. She had gone into the underworld as one thing. She would come out as something else. What that something else was is a question the mythology answers slowly, across multiple stories, in images rather than explanations. The answer is not in the moment of eating. It is in everything that happened after. The Greeks had two names for her, not a formal naming convention, not a title given at a specific ceremony, just the practice, consistent across sources and centuries, of calling her one thing when the story was about who she had been, and another thing when the story was about who she became. The distinction between the names is the story. Before the meadow, she was Corée. The word means simply girl, or maiden, or daughter. It carried no condescension in its original context. It was an accurate description of a specific stage of existence, the daughter of Demeter, the spring, the flowers on the hillsides, the green thing that came back after winter. She was the renewal the world depended on, and the child her mother had built her entire emotional life around. Corée was the before, after the underworld. She was Persephone. The name carried a different weight in the Greek world. It required a different kind of attention. The goddess who bore it was not the girl in the meadow. She was the queen of the dead, the ruler of the place that received every soul that had ever left the living world. The woman who sat beside Hades on the throne of the kingdom below and exercised an authority the myths describe as genuine rather than ceremonial. The transformation between those two names is what the story of Persephone is actually about. When Psyche descended to the underworld as her final task, sent by Aphrodite to retrieve a box of beauty from the queen of the dead, she did not go to ask a favor of a captive goddess waiting to be rescued. She went to the court of Persephone, who received her with the formal authority of someone who had things to give and terms to set. The negotiation was conducted between a mortal woman on a desperate errand and a queen who understood exactly what was being asked and decided what to provide. Psyche left with the box. Persephone gave it to her. The transaction was completed on the queen's terms. When Orpheus came to the underworld with his music and his grief, the sources that describe his audience with the rulers of the dead include Persephone in the account of who was moved. He did not play for Hades alone. He played for both of them. The decision to release Eurydice was not Hades's alone to make. In a kingdom ruled by two, both rulers had to be persuaded. When Theseus and Pirithous arrived with what might be the most audacious plan in the entire history of Greek mythology, the intention of abducting the queen of the underworld and delivering her to Pirithous as a bride, they failed, in a way the myth describes, without extensive explanation, but with obvious finality. The man who had killed the Minotaur was stopped cold in the kingdom of the dead, held there by a throne he could not rise from, until Heracles eventually arrived and pulled him free. Nobody took Persephone. In some traditions within the Greek world, she was considered more frightening than her husband. Hades governed through law, through system, through the impartial application of rules that did not change. He was predictable in the way that institutions are predictable, which is not entirely comforting but at least allows you to know what you are dealing with. Persephone was different. She had come from the world above. She understood grief from the inside, had felt it as the one being taken, rather than the one administering what came after. She had sat in the kingdom of death long enough to understand it fully, to move through it without flinching, to become the kind of authority that the place required. But she had not started there. She had been brought from elsewhere, and that origin gave her a range of response that pure underworld logic did not have. The Greeks who approached Hades with caution sometimes approached Persephone with something closer to wariness. She could be appealed to. She had a history that made her susceptible to certain kinds of arguments, certain kinds of grief. But susceptible did not mean soft. It meant she understood what was being asked of her when someone came to her in pain. And she decided, on terms entirely her own, what to do about it. That is power of a different kind than the systematic power of the god who built the rivers and hired the judges and designed the geometry of punishment. It is the power of someone who has been through something and come out the other side still standing, still capable of judgment, still in command of themselves and their kingdom. She entered the myth as a girl who had been taken. She remained in it as a queen who could not be reduced to what had been done to her. Whether those two things can coexist in the same story is a question the myth asks and does not answer. Because some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be held. The transformation from Charon to Persephone is not a story about what was lost. It is a story about what was built inside a loss, about the specific kind of authority that comes from having been in the dark and learned what the dark actually is, about the difference between someone who rules a place they were born to and someone who rules a place they had to learn, had to earn their understanding of through the sustained experience of being in it. Hades was always the king of the underworld. He drew the lot and walked down and began building. Persephone became the queen. The becoming was the thing. In one world, she ruled. In the other, she was mourned so powerfully that the seasons bent around her absence. She shaped both worlds, just from different thrones. After Persephone, Hades can no longer be understood only as the ruler of the dead. He becomes something more difficult, the god who teaches that even what is buried can return changed, and that what returns is not always what was taken. Zeus moved through the world in stories of desire, punishment, disguise, and intervention. He came down to earth constantly. He wore the shapes of animals, of men, of weather, of golden light. He appeared at critical moments in the lives of mortals he had decided to care about, or to punish, or to use for purposes of his own. He showed up at wars and at births, and at the moments when the fate of a city or a dynasty hung in the balance, and he made his presence felt in ways that left no ambiguity about the fact that a god had been there. Poseidon moved through storm, earthquake, and rage. He was in the water when ships crossed it, in the ground when cities were built on it, in the weather when sailors tried to read it. His moods expressed themselves through phenomena that entire populations felt simultaneously. When he was angry, coastlines changed. When he was satisfied, the sea went flat and the crossing was easy. Hades almost never moved at all. That fact sits differently when you consider what it means alongside everything else we know about him. He was not inactive. His kingdom received every soul that died in the living world above, which meant its population was constantly growing, constantly requiring the administration that the rivers and the judges and the geography he had built were designed to provide. He was doing continuous and demanding work. But the work was done below. He stayed there. In the entire span of Greek mythology, there is essentially one instance of Hades leaving his kingdom for the purpose of intervening in the affairs of the living world. He came up for Persephone. That is it. One departure, with divine authorization, for a specific purpose, after which he returned and did not leave again. Zeus had lightning, Hades had time. Compare that to Zeus's departures, which are too numerous to count, or Poseidon's constant presence in the stories of sailors and heroes, or Apollo's appearances across the entire range of Greek mythology. The gods of the living world were constantly in the living world. They were present, visible, interventionist, involved. Hades was below, and the paradox this created is one of the most quietly powerful things in the entire mythology, because every person who had ever been born would eventually die. Every hero that Zeus favored would eventually stop being favored by anything. Every ship that Poseidon guided through a storm would eventually carry people who would die, whether at sea or on land, or in their beds at the end of long lives. Every prayer offered to every god on Olympus was offered by someone who would, in the end, make the same journey. Every worshipper, every priest, every king and beggar and soldier and farmer and mother and child would eventually arrive at the border of the one kingdom whose ruler had not come looking for them. They would all come to him. Zeus had to act constantly to remain what he was. His authority was, in some sense, a performance that required continuous renewal. The moment he stopped performing it, the gods and mortals and heroes who were always testing the limits of what was allowed would notice the gap. Hades never performed anything. He never announced himself. He never needed to remind anyone that he existed, because everyone already knew. In the way that people know things, they spend most of their lives trying not to think about. He did not need to be powerful in the way that Zeus needed to be powerful. Through continuous assertion, through the management of challenges, through the visible exercise of authority that reminded everyone watching who was in charge, his authority was structural. It was built into the nature of things. Every king who had ever ruled came to Hades. Every tyrant who had ever believed himself above the ordinary laws came to Hades. Every beautiful person whose beauty had opened doors that remained closed to others came to Hades. Every philosopher who had thought carefully about what came after, and every person who had not thought about it at all came to Hades. He did not chase any of them. He did not need to. There is a specific kind of authority that operates this way, through inevitability rather than demonstration, through the certainty of the outcome rather than the visibility of the force producing it. It is harder to challenge than the kind that expresses itself through action, because there is nothing to push back against. You cannot fight patience. You cannot negotiate with structure. You cannot charm or threaten or appeal to the self-interest of something that does not have self-interest in the ordinary sense. That is not doing what it does because it wants something from you, but simply because that is what it does. The most powerful thing in the Greek universe was not the lightning bolt. It was patience, and no one had more of it than the god who waited at the end of every road. On a hillside outside a small village, sometime in the ancient world, a farmer dies. He is not a hero. He has not fought in any war that anyone will write about, has not been favored by any god, has not committed any transgression severe enough to land him in Tartarus. He has spent his life doing what farmers do, reading the sky, working the soil, worrying about the harvest, watching his children grow in the particular way that parents watch children grow when they understand that time is moving in one direction and cannot be stopped. He is buried on the hillside where his family has buried its dead for as long as anyone in the village can remember. A coin is placed over his eyes. The proper rites are performed, and then he crosses the river and arrives in the grey fields of Asphodel, where most of the dead end up, and where what happens next is the thing that the ancient Greeks found most quietly terrifying about death. Nothing dramatic, nothing conclusive, just the slow, patient dissolution of everything that made him particular. The asphodel meadows are the part of the underworld that the modern imagination tends to skip over, because they offer nothing dramatic and nothing comfortable. They are not Tartarus, with its spectacular punishments. They are not Elysium, with its promise that exceptional lives end in exceptional peace. They are the grey middle, the vast undifferentiated space where most of the dead ended up. And what happened there was not punishment and not reward. It was simply continuation of a diminished kind, for a diminished time, followed by dissolution. The shades who wandered the asphodel meadows were not suffering, at least not in the way the inhabitants of Tartarus suffered. They were fading. Their identities were becoming less distinct, their memories losing resolution, the particular shape of who they had been above ground growing less legible as time in the underworld extended. They wandered. They encountered each other. They existed. And slowly, they became less. The Greeks understood this as the natural trajectory of the ordinary dead, and they found it frightening in a way that differed from their fear of punishment. Tartarus was frightening because of what happened there. The asphodel meadows were frightening because of what did not happen. There was no drama. There was no event. There was only the gradual erosion of selfhood in a landscape that neither helped nor hindered the process. This is a vision of the afterlife that offers almost no consolation to the average person. The most widely held expectation was the grey fields, the fading, the eventual dissolution into something that was no longer recognizable as the person who had once walked in sunlight. It is a quieter vision than many later traditions about the afterlife. Less dramatic, less comforting, but perhaps more honest about how ordinary most human lives actually are. What made this bearable, to whatever extent it was bearable, was memory, not the memory of the dead, which Lethe would eventually dissolve. The memory of the living, the practice of speaking the names of those who had died, of maintaining the specific rituals that acknowledged their continued existence in some form, of keeping the relationship between the living and the dead from becoming a complete separation. Greek funerary practice was elaborate and sustained, precisely because the alternative, forgetting the dead entirely, abandoning them to the grey fields without acknowledgement, felt like a second death that the living had the power to either prevent or inflict. You kept the names alive. You spoke them. You performed the rites. You maintained the connection across the boundary that Charon's river marked, not because it changed what the dead experienced, but because it changed what the dead were. A shade that was named and remembered was different from a shade that was not, even if the difference was invisible from the outside. To be forgotten is not the same as never having mattered. The Greeks knew that. Hades knew it better than anyone. That farmer on the hillside, the one no poet will ever write about, the one whose name will be unknown within 3 generations of his death. He arrived in the kingdom of the underworld and was received. His shade was processed through the geography Hades built. He was assigned to Asphodel, along with the vast and nameless majority of everyone who had ever lived. No distinction was made between him and the heroes whose stories fill the mythology. The gate opened. He crossed. The kingdom received him. And somewhere in that receiving is the most democratic thing in the entire Greek religious imagination. Hades did not distinguish between the famous and the anonymous, between the ones whose names would be spoken for centuries and the ones whose names had already been forgotten before they arrived. They all came through the same gate. They all crossed the same river. They all stood, eventually, before the same judges. The dead forget. The living forget the dead, but the kingdom kept receiving them, name by name, story by story, the remembered and the long-forgotten alike. In that sense, Hades was the only one who never truly let anyone go. There is a gap in the archaeological record of ancient Greece that tells you something important. Temples to Zeus were everywhere. They rose on hilltops and in city centers, beside harbors and at crossroads. across the full geographic span of the Greek world and into every territory that Greek culture touched. The same was true of Athena, of Apollo, of Poseidon, of Aphrodite and Artemis, and the full roster of the Olympian divine. You could measure the presence of Greek civilization in a region by counting the temples. And the temples were dedicated, almost without exception, to the gods of the living world. Hades received far less public worship than many Olympian gods, and his cult was often approached with caution. The sanctuary at Elis was reportedly kept closed for most of the year, opening only once annually for the rituals that required it. His worship was conducted at places the Greeks believed were entrances to the underworld itself, which suggests that approaching him required being at the literal boundary of his domain. His rituals were performed at night, rather than in daylight. Offerings were made with faces turned away from the altar, as if direct visual engagement with the act of honoring him carried its own kind of risk. None of this was because the Greeks thought he was evil. They did not build this caution into their religious practice because they believed Hades was malicious in the way that certain forces in certain traditions are understood to be actively malicious, seeking victims, looking for opportunities to cause harm. The Greek understanding of Hades was not that he wanted bad things to happen to people, it was that he was indifferent to whether they happened or not. And that indifference was the thing they could not find a way around. With Zeus, you could negotiate. The history of Greek religion is partly a history of the various ways that mortals found to manage their relationship with the king of the gods. Through prayer and sacrifice, and the careful cultivation of divine favor, through the performance of the rituals that Zeus valued and the avoidance of the transgressions that drew his anger. Zeus was responsive. He could be moved. He had desires and preferences and the kind of self-interest that made him susceptible to the right approach at the right moment. With Poseidon, you could manage. Sailors who understood his moods, who made the right offerings before they launched, who conducted themselves on the water in ways that did not attract his displeasure, could reasonably expect a better experience than those who did not. With Hades, there was nothing you could do. He did not have desires that your worship could satisfy. He did not have preferences that your sacrifice could align with. He did not want anything from you except the one thing you would give him eventually, regardless of how you felt about it. He was not susceptible to charm or beauty, or the specific quality of your prayer, or the size of your offering, because none of those things changed the arithmetic that governed his domain. Everyone died. Everyone came to him. The timing might vary. The specific circumstances might differ. But the outcome was fixed, and no amount of correct religious behavior altered the outcome. It only changed, perhaps, what happened after you arrived. That is what the caution around his name was actually about. When the Greeks avoided saying Hades out loud, when they reached for the euphemisms and the roundabout names and the linguistic distancing, they were not trying to avoid his attention. He was not a god who needed to notice you to affect you. He would receive you when the time came, regardless of whether you had been careful with language. They were avoiding their own attention. They were maintaining the practical distance between themselves and the knowledge that sat at the center of his mythology. The knowledge that everything ends, that the ending is certain, that the certainty is not a threat, but a structural feature of existence that no amount of divine favor can renegotiate. The modern world does this too, with different tools and different language. We have built entire industries around the management of the awareness that Hades represents. The language around death in contemporary usage has become so softened that the word itself often feels clinical or dramatic in contexts where it should feel simply accurate. We say that people pass, that they are lost, that they are no longer with us. We construct enormous social and commercial structures around the idea that the ending is not really an ending, that what comes after is more continuous, more comforting, more like a continuation of what was before than the mythology of Hades suggested. Many later traditions offer more comfort than the Greek underworld did. That comfort is real, and it matters to the people it sustains. But the Greek choice, the choice to build a god around the version of the story that did not offer that comfort, to imagine death as a kingdom run by a ruler who was consistent and fair and completely unmoved by your particular wishes, was a different kind of honesty, the kind that acknowledges what it costs to look at certain things directly, which is why later imaginations needed him to be a villain. A villain can be fought. A villain can be defeated, exposed, overcome by the right hero, with the right weapon, at the right moment. The narrative of the villain has a structure that includes the possibility of a different outcome. Hades cannot be cast as a villain in that sense because there is no version where he loses. Every story in which someone descends to his kingdom and comes back changes nothing about the fundamental arrangement. Orpheus came back. Heracles came back. Psyche came back. All of them, when the time came, arrived in his kingdom for good. He did not pursue them. He did not need to. He simply maintained the kingdom and waited. And the waiting was enough. Perhaps that is why later imaginations needed him to be a villain. A villain can be fought. Hades cannot. He can only be faced. And facing him means accepting something the living world has never been comfortable accepting, that he was not wrong. The temples fell eventually, not all at once. It happened the way most endings happen, gradually and unevenly, with long periods of apparent stability interrupted by accelerating change that only looks inevitable in retrospect. The Roman Empire absorbed the Greek gods and gave them Latin names. Zeus became Jupiter. Poseidon became Neptune. Apollo kept his name, but his oracles went silent and his sanctuaries fell quiet. The temples that had stood on hilltops and in city centers for centuries became ruins, or were converted into churches, or were dismantled for their stone. The gods of the living world went through the transformation that all things in the living world go through eventually. They changed. They were adapted and absorbed and reimagined, and finally, in the contexts that had produced them, they receded. And what happened to Hades? The god of what does not change. He is still there. Not in the sense that his cult persists, or that anyone builds temples to him, or performs the rituals that the Greeks conducted with their faces turned away. Those specific forms of his worship are gone as the civilization that produced them. But the thing he represented, the thing he was built to receive and govern and make sense of, is not gone. The dead are still going somewhere. Not to the grey fields of asphodel. Not across the Styx in Charon's boat. The specific geography of the Greek underworld is mythology, not map. But the question that geography was organized around, the question of what happens to everything that ends, has not been answered in any way that has made the question stop being asked. Every civilization that has come after the Greeks has built its own version of the answer. The answers vary enormously in their details and their comforts and their promises. But the question is the same question. And the question is the same one the Greeks were asking when they built a god around the refusal to pretend that ending was something other than what it was. The ending comes. Something receives it. Whatever that something is, in whatever framework, makes the most sense to the people asking. It occupies the same structural position that Hades occupied in the Greek imagination, the position of the thing that stays when everything else has passed through. Picture a funeral, not an ancient Greek one this time. Any funeral, any time, any place where people are standing together in the presence of something that has ended, trying to find the right words for an experience that has never had the right words, that has been happening since before language existed, and will continue happening after every language currently spoken has changed into something its current speakers would not recognize. There is a moment, just before someone speaks, where everyone is quiet. That quiet is very old. It reaches back past the specific traditions and the specific names and the specific stories to something underneath all of them. The original human encounter with the knowledge that things end, and that the ending receives everything, and that the receiving has a shape even if the shape is hard to look at directly. Hades was one name for that shape, one of the earliest and most carefully considered attempts to build a container large enough to hold what the ending actually is. He did not need to conquer the world. He did not need to be loved. He did not even need to be understood. He only needed to stay. And he stayed, beneath every kingdom that rose above him, every god that was worshipped and forgotten, every human life that burned briefly in the dark. He is staying still,